We are creatures of desire. What we most desire is meaning. What makes us suffer most is a lack of meaning.
The Meaningful Life with Andrew G. Marshall. Marital therapist, author, and communications trainer Andrew G. Marshall invites guests from all walks of life to discuss what makes life meaningful.
Hello, I'm Andrew G. Marshall. Welcome to The Meaningful Life. We're available on Apple, Spotify, Podbeam, and wherever you find your podcasts. One of the great things at this time of the year is looking forward and thinking of what you would like to achieve, and looking back and assessing what you've learned. And that's my plan for this episode with my witness today. Tracey Cox is a sex educator and writer. She's the author of 17 books which have been translated into 20 languages. She has a weekly column for Mail Online and a podcast called Sex Talk with Tracey and Kelsey. She's also a great supporter of The Meaningful Life. She was my very first ever witness. And this is the second time we've looked back at what we've learnt this year. So how was the year for you, Tracey?
It was great. I forgot I was your very first guest. Isn't that lovely? The year was great, and a year full of fantastic podcasts. So as usual, very difficult to pick the four that we have to talk about because so many good guests.
Okay, so let's talk about the first one, Samantha Rodman Whiten.
Yes, Dr. Psych Mum, as she's known. First of all, which I think I said last time, the minute someone's got that New York accent, they've got me in immediately. And I love her because she's kind of a version of me. But she just is she's very unwoke is how I describe Dr. Psych Mum. She says exactly what she thinks, probably a lot of truth. And this podcast was about her talking about being an adult child of a dysfunctional family. And I think that it really was must listen for anyone who's got any sort of toxicity in their family, which I think is probably everyone to a degree. And I thought what was really important is something that she said is that sometimes, I think she'd written a book about it, hadn't she, Andrew? But
yes, the book is called How to Talk to Your Children About Divorce. It was the most recent book, but she's written extensively about being the child of dysfunctional families.
The thing that got me in was when she said, if she talks to people and said, oh, yes, I've written this book about dysfunctional families. And they're like, yeah, my family was a bit dysfunctional, but I'm over it. I'm fine now. And then she comes back to them and says, if those things happen to your kids, what would you do? And they're like, oh, I can't imagine that happening to my kids, So it's very interesting. And we do have that attitude. And there was a bit that she said, which I've chosen as a clip, which is all about what is a perfect parent? What is good enough? And so I thought we could go into that now she talks about what do normal parents look like? If we're talking about what do dysfunctional parents look like, what do normal parents look like?
What do normal parents do that we as children needed?
Well, there's the idea from Winnicott, as you may know, of the good enough parent, somebody that is not too overly attuned and obsessed with the child's needs and wants, but also is not emotionally or physically neglectful. So striking that balance. And really the way that I put it to people is, did you learn how to be a happy adult from observing your parent? And many people just say, no, of course, how could I? They weren't happy at all. So a more functional adult is a happy adult, somebody who gets some sort of joy about everyday life. Their entire identity is not being a parent or obsessing about the child, nor is it being an adult outside of being a parent. They balance being a parent with being an adult in other ways, and they seem to be relatively happy. And that happiness transmits itself to the child such that the child feels that they are being taken care of by a happy and competent adult that they wish to emulate.
How many people can boast of parents like that? But I do. And also she says, she talks about sitcoms to, the old fashioned sitcoms, I guess, where you have the nuclear happy family, and says to kids, what do you think of this sitcom? And some kids are like, oh yeah, it's sort of like cool, a bit like my family. And other kids are like, well, that's completely made up. My family's not like that at all. And I mean, the thing about your podcast, Andrew, can I just say, every time I listen, I think it's to do with me. And I'm like, God, maybe my parents were dysfunctional. And she talks about how people react to coming from a dysfunctional family. And a few of the things I think lots of people would identify with: high achievers, in the sense that they, Sam said, they need to be their own superhero to rescue themselves from their family. Fairy tale ending addicts, what you didn't get in childhood, you want as an adult. And people pleasers, some substance abusers, all very, very, very interesting. And she had lots of practical advice as well about what do you do if you've got, particularly toxic parents, or just parents that aren't necessarily great to be around when you're older. And can you remember what she was talking about with grey rocking, Andrew? Can you remember that?
It's funny. I don't have any recollection of that at all. So is she going to explain that to us, or are you going to?
She's going to explain it. So yes, let's go into the next clip.
Yes, but I think you can change the way that you interact with your parents. I mean, there's no way you're going to change your parents' personality. You can approach them differently. And I think that is something that's really helpful.
Yes, approaching them differently and frequently not getting caught into the drama, creating boundaries, gray rocking,
Gray rocking?
Gray rocking is a term of being literally boring like a gray rock. So somebody who's narcissistic or borderline, this would not be for the parents who are withdrawn anyway, but for the more dramatic, histrionic parents, they try to hook you into some sort of story, or they try to get information about you that they could potentially use against you, not for internally really malicious motivations, but because that's how they relate, is via drama and histrionics. And instead, you just kind of talk about the weather. You just have a smooth, bland expression. You don't give them anything to work with. It's just kind of how you would talk to a crazy person if they sat next to you on the subway. It's just kind of, you just really bland, boring like a gray rock. And this is a very useful, practical strategy for many people who deal with more of these narcissistic or borderline trait people.
The minute I said I don't remember grey rocking and she started talking about it, I do remember it. And I think the reason why, and it is a wonderful technique, by the way, I think the reason why I don't remember it is because my parents were the sort of people who never talked about anything serious. So all we ever talked about was grey rock topics like the garden and the weather.
Right, okay.
And I was the one that was the awkward one, which was trying to get us to talk about something a little bit more interesting.
Right.
So I had the opposite problem. I was trying to un-grey rock my parents. But
right, yeah. I think my parents were quite normal in that sense, and that we were quite open and talked about things. But she also talks about puppy training your parents, where, you ignore the puppy when they're jumping all over you, and then you sort of reward it when it's sleeping nicely in its cot. So yeah, it would only work with dramatic parents as opposed to parents who are withdrawn. But she speaks a lot of sense, though, and I think that she's quite good on quite out there. I don't necessarily agree with her on all her stuff on what she writes, but I did really, really like this podcast. Do you think she is from New York? Did I get that right?
Yeah, I think so, most definitely. And if you're interested in the subject of dysfunctional parents and being the child of dysfunctional parents, I'm in the process of trying to line up another program where we're going to look at the signs, the sort of unusual signs that says your parents were sort of dysfunctional. I mean, one example would be that you feel that you have to justify your feelings. So you don't just say, I'm angry. You have to give all the reasons why, because your feelings were not acceptable. And it's something I find a lot with my clients, that people try and justify their feelings. And I say, you don't need to justify your feelings. They are your feelings. And the problem is, while you're justifying why you're angry to your partner's hearing that not as an explanation about you, but as more criticism about them. And if you just say, I'm angry, and, you give the top line because you were late coming home, rather than giving all the details of it, they're much more likely to accept it. But if you are the child of dysfunctional parents, you feel the need to justify, and it sort of, you can't stop yourself. So I think that was a brilliant program, and it's a topic we're going to return to next year.
Yes.
So let me give you my first choice, which I chose particularly because, as somebody who writes about sex, I thought you would be rather interested in this different take. It's Douglas Thomas, and he's a Jungian analyst, and the author, and I think this is a fabulous title, The Deep Psychology of BDSM and Kink, Jungian and archetypal perspectives, and this is the bit I think is wonderful, on the soul's transgressive necessities.
Oh my goodness.
I mean, to think that our soul has transgressive necessities, and what might they be?
Do you think that a publisher allowed a title that long?
Well,
that is so unusual.
It's an academic book, it's for a specialist market. But generally, the idea is that fantasies are a window into our conscious and getting to know ourselves better rather than something to fear, which is something I think would be interesting for us to talk about after we've heard the clip. Although most people are going to be horrified or worried about the idea of BDSM and kink, it does actually deal with two issues that I see with all of my clients. The first one is that they have problems getting into sex. So getting out of the everyday world into the sensual world, that's quite difficult to do. You can rely on passion when you're first together, but after 20 years, passion isn't going to do it, and you have to find other ways. Absolutely, BDSM is quite good with that. And the other problem they have is that the endings of sex tend to be rather abrupt. We just sort of roll over, and we don't get the benefit of really nurturing our relationship. And the whole subject of kissing and cuddling after sex is something I talked about with Douglas.
Some people, I think, sort of laugh at kinksters and people who are into BDSM because there can be so much talking. But, really as a sexual type, there are a lot of people who are sapiosexual that are into kink and BDSM where the talking is almost as fun as the doing. I should say almost. I don't know that everybody would agree with that. But communication also leads us to the topic of aftercare, which I really want to give a little bit of time to here and emphasize this because it's neglected, frankly, and it's an extremely important element of this, which is it makes it different from conventional sex and sexuality, right? Like you're saying, not only get drunk, get naked, and jump on top of each other, but afterwards, let's pretend it didn't happen. Or certainly we're not going to talk about it. In BDSM and kink, it's very important to recognize that there is something that is being altered in the brain on a neurochemical level when we transition into what is called sub-headspace. And the dominant person has their own version of this with what is also known as top headspace. And there can be a tremendous amount of adrenaline. There can be a real endorphin rush. There's a very high state of arousal that can come with BDSM play. It makes it very intense, very pleasurable, very exciting, very much something outside of the quotidian, the everyday. But there can be a crash afterwards, and that is partly neurochemistry, but I think that it's also partly psychological, that people can be in a space where they are coming back into a more familiar version of their conscious life, and they reflect and they say, holy smokes, what did I just do? What happened? And it's very important at that point to maintain the connection with the partner and to have a bit of time to debrief. Now, there are some people into kink and BDSM who say aftercare is overrated. There's too much emphasis placed on it. My aftercare is a cigarette, and please don't touch me anymore. Fair enough. But I think that for people that are especially just getting into this and exploring, it's one of the ways that they receive some reassurance and some affirmation that this is something that can be integrated into the rest of the conscious personality. It not remain something as a splinter, fragmented aspect of who they are, but that it's okay that you can explore these things. And as we were saying earlier on, from the very beginning of psychoanalysis and analytical psychology, Freud was making the point that what he called polymorphous perversion was not a bad thing. He said, we are all polymorphously perverse. It is a normal part of being a human being. And so it didn't have anywhere near the pejorative connotation that it's developed in the years since he pioneered the field. And so the whole idea of sadism and masochism is that we all whether we are into BDSM and kink or not, all of us have to contend with the reality that sometimes we enjoy being cruel. And sometimes that cruelty is directed towards other people, and sometimes it's directed towards ourselves. But it's part of the normal human experience. And BDSM and kink is a place where that can be really explored and experimented with in depth and creatively. But coming back out of it, aftercare is so important to be able to talk about that and say, what happened for you? Here's what I experienced. And people can get very granular, which is something we typically don't do with our sex lives. Hey, there was a moment in there where it looked to me like something was happening for you or it was too much. And I wasn't sure if I was pushing too hard or not. What was that? And the other person might be like, oh my God, I wanted you to go further.
Well, there's so much to unpack there. It's just not even funny, isn't it? That aspect of cruel, we're all a little bit cruel, I thought was fascinating. And BDSM and kink is something that's completely fascinating. And I mean, when you said that most of your clients have problems getting into sex and then, the aftercare afterwards, the getting into sex is, I would say almost every single question we get for the podcast is a version of that. It's like, how do I get out of my everyday and get into sex? And I've never thought of it that way, that kink would be a fantastic way to do it, because it's a bit like role play, isn't it? It's taking you out of your everyday. It's a real obvious sexual trigger to sort of get out the implements, perhaps to assume a certain pose. And suddenly it's like, okay, brain, we're not in mum and dad mode now. We're not like worrying about the kids going to school. We're actually, this is for us. This is play. And of course, pain is one of the few things that completely takes you out of yourself. So it is something that you're right that people are scared of, but gosh, I'll be certainly listening to that one. Going back, I don't know how I missed it, quite frankly.
Well, and I think one of the things that he talks about that is actually very interesting is that the word fetish actually originally comes from the religious world, and
really?
that people would have these items that they would call them their fetish that would actually connect them with prayer or whatever it was that they were going to do. So it was some token, some image, some implement that would actually help them in the ritual, and the ritual would take them from the everyday world into the sensual world, or in this case, the religious world. So, putting on a pair of high heels, kinky boots sort of kind of thing, or some costume, or getting out, as you say, some toy or implement out and setting it out is a way of actually getting from one world into another. What do you think of the idea of the soul having dark necessities?
I think it would have to, wouldn't it? I would just assume that the soul would have dark necessities because, those moments when you're with yourself and sometimes you have thoughts. What was I watching the other day? And one of the lines that somebody said was, I would tell you what it was, but I'm too embarrassed of the thought that I've just had. We all have deep, dark, awful thoughts. It's part of the human nature, isn't it? I mean, we are all cruel in lots of ways. However nice the person, sometimes I think the nicer the person on the outside, the crueler they probably are on the inside. But the soul can't be pure, can it? It would not be real.
Well, everything has a light side and a dark side. So we only actually think of the light side of sexuality. And if we sort of push down and hide material rather than have a relationship with it, that's when we begin to have problems with it.
But I think to explore the dark side of sex, is so important though, because men are good at that. Women are less good at that. They don't like to see that sort of blatant, bald sort of sexuality. They don't like to see evidence of that because it's like, wow, he really is. So it's in control of him rather than the other way around. But I think that's where you have great sex that lasts. If you don't tap into it, it's very hard to have good sex that lasts.
Yeah, you need to be able to get in contact with your animal body, don't you?
Absolutely.
The other phrase I liked was the idea of getting granular with sex and actually talking about it afterwards. And I must admit, I did take up that advice and did actually ask, was that too much? And I got, in fact, actually the same answer as came up there as no, I wanted more. And I thought, pull back, but you never actually learn these things unless, as he says, you do get granular.
When you think about it, in the beginning of a relationship, you discuss it, don't you? It's like, wow, that was fantastic. This was fantastic. And then afterwards, you just stop. You just stop talking about it because probably nothing much happens out of the ordinary. So why would you talk about it?
And you're frightened if you say, how was it for you? They're going to say, well, actually, it was a bit dull.
Yes.
But if they do, then you can have a conversation. Well, what have we stopped doing that used to be great? Or what would you like to do that would make it less dull?
Perfect.
So let's have your second choice.
Which is Jessica talking about anxious attachment. Now, ever since attachment theory came out, I think every single person in the world who's remotely interested in psychology and self-analysis has sort of cottoned onto this and tried to analyze which one they are. And I remember having terrible problems with relationships and then reading a book about attachment and discovering that I was anxious avoidant and just made sense of so many things in my life. So I found it incredibly helpful. And I'm sure, I don't know whether you've got figures on who listens to what, but I'm sure that that would have been such a popular topic with Jessica talking about it. She was very personal journey, wasn't it, which she talked about, which is always great. I think you sort of get more from it when someone's been through it themselves. Maybe you should explain the anxious attachment theory for people who don't know about it, but it's to do with how babies attach to their caregivers, isn't it?
Yes. So if you feel that your mother or father or your main caregiver is there and available for you, then you're going to be able to move to them without any problems at all. So you would be what's called securely attached. And if they're not available, and, this could be because they're ill or they're overwhelmed in some kind of sense, you're going to have to develop some kind of strategy to deal with it. Now, this is all happening unconsciously because babies are not actually sitting there thinking, how am I going to deal with this? But the people who are very detached will sort of say, well, I don't have needs. It's sort of a bit like what happens if you leave a baby to cry. After a while, it sort of sorts itself out. In other words, it says, well, I don't have any needs, I'm okay, when it's not really. Or they can get this message that my caregiver is unreliable, and therefore they're always going to be anxious that they're going to disappear. And that's the anxiously attached.
Sure. So we have something called neuroception. So this is I like to think of it as invisible radar, but we're always scanning our environment for safety or threat, right? We always want to feel safe. And so if disconnect was part of our childhood or part of our pattern, we're going to look for and feel anytime our partner pulls away, withdrawals or disconnects. And we can feel that on an energetic level. And it can awaken a very early part of us. And I think I write about that. It awakened my automatic nervous system to the point where it was very visceral. It was very sensational inside my body. And I think anybody who's listening can maybe think of a time when their partner shut down or didn't respond, or, we all go through these periods and logically we're like, okay, maybe they're just busy or they're just whatever. But our body remembers, connections. And our body remembers the loss of connection. And so when anything resembles a loss of connection, and when the connection's close to us, it can awaken earlier sensations of loss of connection. And what people really don't understand is that the body keeps the score, right? And the body and the sensations that are woken up are actually memory.
Amazing, isn't it? I mean, I've been in relationships and probably been a bit like that where, and she talks about it too, where you react like a baby. Like if your partner's suddenly not available, the logic goes out the window and you are running towards them like a child with no self-regulation whatsoever. And if you are scared of intimacy, you just you just disappear. I went out with one guy and he just used to disappear for 2 weeks at a time when he couldn't cope with anything. And then you met the mother and it was like, okay, that makes sense now. But seriously, it's such an important thing, I think, for couples to talk about, is to do the sort of, work out, well, what do you think you're secure? Do you think you're this? Do you think you're that? And then you just have a little window into, okay, well, that's why that person's behaving like that. And this is why I behave like this. And I mean, I would say that would improve at least a third of the problems that most couples struggle with. Would you agree, Andrew? I think it really is an important part of relationships to figure this one out.
Yes, but I also think it's really important that we don't label ourselves and other people too much and say, you're doing this, or I'm stuck like that, because it is something that is very fluid. And generally, both people I mean, what you tend to get is somebody who is going to be avoidant and somebody who's going to be anxious together. And they have a sort of a dance, and it's very difficult to find a comfortable place in the middle. But both people, if you're not careful, will label the other person as the problem. The problem is you're too needy. The problem is you don't take care of me. And you can go round in a circle. So,
yeah, and there is a point where you can't keep blaming your parents, isn't there? There really is.
Probably
and
your
also,
deathbed.
Yeah. But also I find, because I'm a bit anxious avoidant, as I said, but when I'm with a secure person like my husband, I become secure. And I think I've made him a bit anxious, to be honest. I've probably passed on a bit to him. But you're right. Yes, it's not the be all and end all, like, oh, okay, all my problems are solved. But she talks about something else where she's talking about how we struggle with control and the sorts of behaviors that we get up to.
People who are anxiously attached, I think, struggle with control. And one of the things is that you can't control another person's behavior, and getting out of the dynamic of, and I will try everything that we tried when we're small. We'll fight, we'll collapse, we'll run towards, we'll run away. But like just coming to this conclusion that another person's behavior has nothing to do with me. Like I was with someone where their behavior was like, it was really out there. And I was like, they're in so much fear that this is what their behavior is doing, and trying not to personalize it, and then constantly surrendering the control of trying to get someone to do something that seems pretty, mundane or whatever, but just letting go. I mean, I think for anxious people, we lose ourselves a lot in relationships, and letting go of other people's behaviors is something that we're constantly working on.
So the main task is actually going inwards rather than being so outwardly focused. Yes.
And then you went on, Andrew, to talk about, looking after she calls it her little me, the inner child, I suppose, and just saying, okay, well, this behavior isn't, who I am now. It's reacting to what I was like when I was younger or as a teenager or whenever. I don't know whether, do teenage things influence attachment patterns? Because I feel like mine did.
Right. In what way?
Well, my dad left when I was 15, and I feel like that's where the trauma came from, rather than maybe not being looked after correctly as a baby.
Well, that would make you very anxious and worried that other people are going to leave you as well. So I think the answer to your question is yes.
Yeah. So I wonder whether I decided I was anxious avoidant because of that, and it actually wasn't anything to do with my caregiving. So it's interesting. So you've got to be careful with it, don't you? You do have to be careful with all of this stuff.
And the important thing is that once you actually know about it, you can actually negotiate together, and you can say, look, I understand you need time to decompress, but what I need to know is you're going to come back. So if you're going, and that's perfectly okay, can you tell me how long it's going to be for? Because if it's, 20 minutes, half an hour, or even 2 hours, and I know that's what's happening, well, I can cope with that without any problems. It's the not knowing that is the really difficult part of it.
I agree, totally.
And, if you do need time out and you say to your partner, I need to de-stress, I'm going to go out onto the balcony and smoke a cigarette, for example, and it's been talked about in advance, that's much easier for them to cope with than you just storming off to the balcony.
Because they think it's all over, and then it feeds into everything. Yeah. Gosh, if only we could all be, it's all so easy in theory, isn't it? And then when you like over emotional and, drowning and flooded with emotion, it all just goes out the window sometimes.
Well, I think the most important thing to say is remember other people's behaviour has got nothing to do with you. It's probably been influenced by somebody that arrived many, many years before you. And unfortunately, because we as children are the centre of the world, because we're not actually adult enough to realise that, there are other people and our parents have their individual needs, we think it's about us. And generally it's not. It's not that our mother didn't love us. It's that our mother had a drink problem, or she had to go off to work. She had to pay the bills. And we tend to think it's about us. And when you sort of think, well, it's not all about me, that can actually just de-stress you that little bit and allow you to look after the little me and to bring some of your adult faculties to bear.
Because some people go through their entire life thinking it's about them, and they never get past that. And it's a horrible world if you think like that. isn't it? Because everything's a slight, every single thing that, and somebody's just had a bad day and you happen to be in front of them at that time. But it is hard it's hard not to take things personally, but I do think that's brilliant advice it should be the mantra stamped on everybody's head. This is not always about me.
Well, on the subject of our relationships, I'm going to give you my selection, which is Robert Glover. And I was rather pleased with this title. It's called People Pleasing, Why Nobody Gets Pleased. Because we think if we people please, we will please them. So Robert is the author of No More Mr. Nice Guy. And being a people pleaser has some great qualities. You avoid conflict. You don't rock the boat. You often are a bit of a caretaker for other people. But there are problems. You repress your feelings. You have difficulty making your own needs a priority. And then you have something called covert contracts.
Let's talk about covert contracts. Are you okay with that?
Yep, sure.
Because you've teed it up. In No More Mr. Nice Guy, I talk about 3 basic covert contracts. And I'll even present them even clearer here than I do in the book. Nice guys and nice girls. So people pleasers. These people that are seeking external validation, hiding anything about them because they think that might, cause them to be unloved or unliked or get abandoned, have 3 basic covert contracts. Number 1 is that if I'm a good guy, then I will be liked and loved. Now, one thing I see a lot in men, we can tack onto that, and the person I want to have sex with me will want to have sex with me too, because I'm a good guy, right? I listen to her talk about her problems. I do nice things for her. I treat her better than her ex that she keeps complaining about, but going back to. I made her car payment for her. I helped her sister move. She should like me and love me and want to have sex with me, even though I completely have hidden my sexual intentions and sexual agenda from her. She should read my mind and know. Okay? That's covert contract number 1. And these are all manipulative. They're all giving to get. They all have strings attached. And as the name implies, they're covert. Often the nice guy is even unconscious to the contracts, and so is everybody else. So covert contract number 2, here's the mind reading one. If I read your mind and give to you what I think you want or need without you having to ask, then you will read my mind and give to me what I want and need without me having to ask. Now, a lot of problems with that. Of course, you don't know the contract exists. I'm not really reading your mind. I'm just giving to you out of, well, if I give this to you, you'll give something back. It's manipulation. You can't read my mind. And nice guys are actually terrible at letting people give to them. All the while we give, and we want all this appreciation and maybe reciprocity. We don't let it in. We don't let it happen. And then covert contract number 3 for the nice guy syndrome is that if I do everything right, then I will have a smooth, problem-free life. Now,
good luck with that.
Good luck. Yeah. Who gets everything right? Every great religious philosophical treatise basically says, we all fall short. None of us get it right. And the second part is life is not smooth and problem-free. The cosmos is chaotic by nature, right? There's always everything state of creation and entropy. So life is not smooth and problem-free. So it's kind of a Peter Pan-ish little boy. If I please mommy, then everything will go well and I'll get what I want.
I've been thinking a lot ever since that program actually about covert contracts. And I actually ask people sometimes, what are the covert contracts that you and your partner have that you sort of are half aware of and you feel hard done by because they're not actually being met, but they haven't actually been spelt out. So your partner doesn't actually realize that they're breaking a contract. And anyway, they never signed the contract in the first place.
It is extraordinary when you think about it. There probably are dozens of covert contracts that we make without even being conscious of making them, isn't it? You just assume that, because you're my partner, you're going to do this because that's what I expect from a partner. And yeah, very interesting. And I think the people-pleasy thing, again, as I said, with all of your things, I think that I'm a people-pleaser. And I was just like, oh my God, I completely identify with all of those things. I really do, especially but I've done everything right by you, so why aren't you doing everything right by me sort of thing. You expect that if you behave well, someone else is going to behave well.
And if I do X, you won't criticize me.
Yes, that's another one.
And therefore, when you do criticize me, it is a violation of a contract rather than just they're upset that, I didn't put the toilet seat down.
What's his advice for not being a people pleaser? How do you get out of it?
Well, I think the core of it is to actually know yourself better, because people pleasers are so outwardly focused, they don't actually know what their own needs are. So first and foremost, you've actually got to work out your own needs, some of which you might be able to meet yourself. And that takes some of the strain off. And number two, you actually ask for them, which is something that people prefer to be asked rather than grumpy about something that they don't really know. And the third thing is that you help them deal with conflict and the other person being upset, because they want to immediately fix it. So they apologize straight away when they don't really mean it. They swallow their upset, or they start defending themselves. And basically, I train them to listen rather than try and rescue the situation or rescue themselves. Because actually, 9 times out of 10, if you really listen to your partner's upset, they will calm down. The time when they're going to get even more angry is when you're not listening to them.
That's right. Yeah, so listening, often, if you've just said it and you feel like your partner's heard you, that is, it gets rid of most things, doesn't it? But I think, go on, sorry.
I was just going to say, it's not just listening, it's actually summarizing what they said, so that you're not just sitting there with a nodding head like a dog in the back of a car. You're saying, so you're upset about A, B, and C, and you think D. You don't have to comment on it, no editorializing, but they feel heard because you've actually put what you think are the main points. And if you haven't got the main points, they'll say, yes, and I'm also angry about X as well. And that really calms the situation down.
I've done that exercise with somebody and said, repeat it back, listen to me and then tell me what you think I just said. And they said, it was like they'd been listening to somebody else. It was so far off the mark because they were listening with anger, and it was just completely, and then it took about 5 goes to get them to even remotely get close to what I was trying to say. So it's so interesting. It's such a good exercise to do that, even in everyday life with friends. And, to just, if somebody looks a bit taken aback by what you've said, is to say, what did you think I just said then? Because you're looking a bit upset and I certainly didn't mean it like that. So it is a great exercise to do that.
I have a course called My Best Relationship Tools, and I have a whole module on this, reflecting back. So if you go to my website, which is andrewgmarshall.com, and you look at the courses, look for My Best Relationship Tools, and maybe that could be your New Year's resolution to do it with your partner.
The Meaningful Life with Andrew G. Marshall. Please follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, and visit our website, andrewgmarshall.com/podcast, where you can join our supporters club and unlock bonus material and other benefits.
So, what have you got as your third choice?
My third choice is Robert Neimeyer, which is The 6 Tasks of Grief and How Do We Live with Loss. And there are so many different reasons why I love some of your podcasts, and some are because of the way the person speaks and how eloquent they are, and others are because of the content. And this guy, Robert, just nailed both. He was so eloquent with the story of, when his father committed suicide when he was 11. He had to become the man in the family. The family was shattered. His mother never recovers. She turns to drink. She tries to commit suicide many times. And he just talks about how to deal with loss. And a wonderful quote that he says, if you don't deal with loss, you pass it on to the next generation to sort out. And I just find that so just spot on, is it? It's absolutely spot on. Same with trauma, isn't it?
The amazing thing is, both of us actually chose the same episode. So we're going to have, first of all, my clips from it, and then we're going to have your clips from it. Okay. So if you don't know about Robert, he's the professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of Memphis, and he's the director of the Portland Institute for Loss and Transition. And I started off by giving him a comment from himself, which is, we are wired for attachment in a world of impermanence. And I asked him to unpack the quote.
The reality of our human circumstance is that we are wired to attach to people, places, projects, possessions, possibilities, all of which are life-defining for us. We invest ourselves in them. We cherish them. We pursue them. But ultimately, all of those same people, places, projects, possessions, possibilities are finite. They will all rise up and be a part of our life for a time. They will all fall away. Loss is the one guaranteed outcome in life. And so when we recognize that everyone and everything that we love, we will one day lose, at least in an earthly sense, then it really establishes loss as a kind of core course in the curriculum of life. It's not one that we can choose not to take. It's not an elective. And indeed, it's a course in which we'll be enrolled for the rest of our lives. So that's the gist of that quote is underscoring the universality of this and how it has an important role to play in every life lived.
So at the moment, I'm sort of coming straight up against that particular topic because I have a dog that's 12 and a half years old and seems to have a problem that the vet can't get to the bottom of. And, you're very aware of the impermanence of everything. But the problem is when you get a puppy, although you intellectually know that you're going to outlive it, you sort of put it off and you say, I'll think about that another day. And then unfortunately, another day arrives.
Sadly, it does. I just want to dignify such losses and not diminish them. Some of the keenest grief I ever felt was when I had to make the difficult decision with my wife to put down or euthanize our dog, who similar age to yours, just a year or two older, under conditions of failure in multiple systems that could not be reversed. That was anguishing. It was tender. And it was a shared emotional journey that we made as a family as we had to euthanize our dog Cole. I dug a hole in the backyard and we buried him several feet deep. In some way, of course, that hole almost was something I felt inside myself, a void and emptiness. And so depositing him in that and having a memorial service for him, bringing together family and others who loved him, at least validated his presence in our collective lives. And I think this is one of the many ways in which we seek to give meaning to loss. We find a place for it. We acknowledge it in the world, shared with others. We ritualize it. We find some way of wrapping our heads and hearts around something we deeply wish would not happen, but it does.
So thank you for dignifying that. And let's use that as an example for what you also say. The goal is to integrate the loss into our life. So how do you integrate a loss into your life?
Well, of course, this has many dimensions, but in a kind of quick shorthand, what I would say is that we're attempting to include it as a chapter in our life story, a significant one, sometimes a turning point chapter, as in the death of my father. And that is to say that we find a way of speaking about the loss, to the loss. We're able to negotiate it in a world shared with others who want to hear the story, who can contribute to the story, who can value the character who has been lost. In the case of a person or a pet, other losses, of course, of a relationship, of health, of a country of origin under circumstances of necessary migration, a loss of beliefs. There are losses, abstract and concrete, that are consequential. But we at least do have some rituals for negotiating the losses of such living entities as people and pets. And so that provides a measure of consolation.
So that was the part that I selected from it. I love the idea that loss is a core curriculum in life because it's one of those curriculums we want to skip, really, isn't it?
Yeah, it's kind of depressing, isn't it?
Well, I think it's more depressing if we try and pretend it doesn't happen. And I think more pain is caused by somebody saying, but, oh, I'm sorry to hear about your loss, but at least it was quick, or at least they had a long, good life. And that sort of diminishes your pain and doesn't allow it to be there. So I think more of the problem of grief is that we don't invite it in and allow it to sit and have a cup of tea with us.
People get very uncomfortable, don't they, with grief? Yeah,
well, the problem is either it will keep knocking on our door or it will actually set up home with us. But, grief is actually a visitor. It's not going to, and if you make it a welcome visitor and it comes around from time to time, you can live with it. But, if it's just forever knocking on the door and you pretend you're not in, or it's actually in the spare bedroom, that's the time when it becomes a little bit overwhelming.
I loved when he talked about how the places people get stuck with dealing with loss is their relationship to the deceased and how they don't want it to end, especially, if it's a love, any grief at all. But if it's something that you really was so important in life, like your partner dies, how does that relationship work now? There's no physical presence. And he talks about how it doesn't mean that the relationship's over because it's that sort of like, but how am I going to, get through my life without that person beside me? And trying to come to grips with that person can still be beside you, but just because they're not physically there doesn't mean that they're not psychologically or, with you soul-wise, and for want of another word. And I found all that really quite reassuring. And also the bit that I really was fascinated in was you asked him about contacting the dead, what he thought about that. When people ask him, well, do you think, because of what his speciality is, is there life after death? What do you think about people who try to contact people and talk to them even though they're dead?
I don't know about the ontological status of a spiritual realm, meaning is it something that's really out there and am I tapping into conversations with the dead? But what I do know that as a psychologist and as a person, anything that is experienced as real is real in its consequences. And so when you or I have the astonishing honor of sitting in the presence of someone who is reaching into the deepest wells of grief or concern or anguish, and doing so also reach out to someone who can potentially help them with that. And it might be someone with whom they need to resolve a really problematic issue. It might be someone whose support would mean the world to them. As they experience that exchange as something very real and tangible, then you and I also do. And that's an incredible resource to work with when the pain that we're experiencing is also in relation to that same person. And so why would we not then invoke that person's presence as a potential ally in addressing the pain?
I've been thinking a lot about loss and death because I've just come back from Mexico and I went there specifically to experience the Day of the Dead celebrations. And it is a very different attitude to death. So the main idea is everybody sets up an altar in their house and they put the photographs of people who died. They put orange marigolds or purple marigolds. They put things that the dead people would like. So there might be a small bottle of whiskey. There might be some chocolate. Mm-hmm. If they smoked, there'll be a cigarette for them. And the idea is that at midnight, the dead return. And the place that I went to, everybody goes to the graveyards. They clean the grave. They decorate it with flowers and put candles on it. And they all have a meal there. So the whole family sits around the grave and they have a meal and they wait for the people to arrive.
Wow.
My in-laws claim that they were upstairs watching television that night and they heard the candle fall over on their family altar. And they say that that was their loved ones showing them that they came.
Did you go to the cemetery and sit
Yes,
with people?
I went to the cemetery. I went in the afternoon when people were preparing, and then in the early evening. I wasn't there at midnight because my friends, gnashing of teeth now, were worried about drunk drivers on the roads because they all get drunk.
Right.
And wanted to leave before midnight. I always wanted to be there to see what happened, to witness the dead returning.
Exactly.
But I mean, that they all dress up. Well, not all. The pure folk thing, they don't dress up, but they have an image of a skeleton called Katerina, who's a woman who has a large hat and fancy clothes, which was a comment on society that even rich people are going to die. And everybody dresses up as Katerina, and the women put on makeup to make themselves look like corpses. And it's a sort of strange crossover between Halloween and Day of the Dead. So you have people dressed up as corpses, and then you get some sort of more modern people who will dress up as the Texas Chainsaw Massacre guy and turn up with a chainsaw to pretend to cut people's heads off.
So is the idea that the person comes back at midnight and you have a chance to right wrongs or talk to them and see how they are? And is it that sort of check-in thing, or is it just honouring their life, or a bit of both, I suppose? I
think it's a bit of both. I think what's really nice is actually feeling that other people remember your loss. So my partner is Mexican, and his parents appeared on several people's family altars, his brothers, but also his cousins as well. And seeing that photograph and seeing that those people meant enough to be on somebody else's in the family's altar actually makes you feel good. Unfortunately, my dog Pumpkin did die, and there is a couple of days before the Day of the Dead, which is the Day of the Pets. The pets come back.
Oh, wow.
And my brother-in-law put together an altar for the pets of all the pictures of them and, dog treats. And he found off the internet a picture of our dog, and Pumpkin was on the family dog altar. And it was just so wonderful to have that loss acknowledged.
Yeah.
And people talk about the people that died. I'm sure some people do feel they have conversations with them, but just that sense that
they aren't forgotten.
They aren't forgotten. They cannot be not talked about. That's particularly strong for me, because we were talking earlier about how if you don't deal with the loss, you pass it on to the next generation, or maybe the next two generations. Because my great uncle died at the Somme in the First World War, and when the telegram came, my great grandfather went up to his room and locked the door and didn't come down for several days. And when he did come down, he said, "Nobody will ever speak about our son again."
Wow.
And, my family issue is that nobody talks about anything serious.
Gosh.
Except for me, who spends all day talking to my clients about important things and talking to you on my podcast about important things. So, it's been passed on to two generations later to sort out. And this is the complete opposite of the idea of let's not talk about the dead because it'll upset us.
I agree. My I'm back at the story about your grandfather and then all that coming down through the generations. My sister lost a baby. He lived till he was 1 year old and then died. And she said the worst thing is that no one ever mentions his name. No one talks about him because they fear that she'll get upset about it. And she said that what upsets her is that no one acknowledges him. And they didn't acknowledge him at all. And especially because he was a little baby and he got to a year and never left hospital. It's like she said that it's like he didn't exist. Everybody's pretending, well, you've got two other children now. Why do we need to talk about the one that died? And it's really not helpful at all. So I think that's a wonderful thing. Why don't we think, I love the Jewish thing. I went to a Jewish prayers, when somebody dies and then you go morning and evening for 6 days or 5 days or whatever it is. And I remember going to that and thinking, wow, why don't Christians do that? Because that's so helpful. The person normally sits in their house crying their eyes out, like you get casserole shoved through the door and that's it. Whereas the Jewish, religion where everybody comes and you've got two things to focus on each day to get you through that initial shock period. I think things like that are fantastic to help people through. I think the way we deal with death in Western society is just wrong on so many different levels. I don't even know where to start with where I think it's wrong, but it's all cockeyed and it's not set up for people to be able to process it and move on with their lives at all.
I couldn't agree with you more on that topic. Now, we've done 3 choices each. We've got one more to do. We're going to do that in the bonus material. I'm going to be talking about Joseph Lee, the Jungian analyst and member of this Jungian Life podcast. And we're going to be talking about what to do if you can't remember your dreams. Tracey is going to be talking about the beautiful and disturbing and dangerous world of our unconscious and comas. If you'd like to hear that, and also what we might want to achieve in 2025, you need to subscribe to the bonus material. And if you want to know how to do that, here are the details.
You've been listening to The Meaningful Life with Andrew G. Marshall. You can follow Andrew on Twitter, like him on Facebook, and please leave a review wherever you consume your podcasts. Making, editing, and distributing The Meaningful Life comes with substantial costs, and we'd like to ask for your help. Visit our website, andrewgmarshall.com/podcast, where you can join our supporters club and unlock bonus material for every program, send in a letter to be discussed by Andrew and his guests, and join a community of other people seeking to make their life meaningful. At the gold level, you get even more benefits. Production of The Meaningful Life with Andrew G. Marshall is by Michael Dooney. Social media by Madeleine Healy. Sound engineering and theme tune by Sebastian de la Luz Mendoza. And I'm Susie Colick. Please tell your friends and spread the word. Thank you.